Good afternoon, this is Gary Kavanagh here on TRSI. I'm here today with my colleague Michael Dwyer after 2 weeks spent wandering the wilds of Europe, fulfilling our other obligations. Michael, how have you been?
I've been very well, thank you, Gary, other than a sore finger. Sweden wasn't that wild, but it was kind of crazy.
I thought, Michael, we might start on the European side of things. On the Migration Pact, I had originally planned that we would talk about it now, Michael. But I've noted in the conversation I've seen from people about it on both sides, those who support it and those who are against it, there is an incredible amount of false and incorrect information, a lot of assumptions being made about it that don't really stand up.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping instead that we'll actually be able to, maybe not next week, but whenever we can, bring in someone with an expertise in European law, probably from Brussels, to go through it. Both the politics of it, which are quite interesting, and what it actually says. Politically, this is actually quite an interesting little beast of a pact, because it's designed to stop the populist right cutting into, particularly the EPP's support, but not just the EPP's support. So there's a lot of stuff in there that is actually quite solid. Of course, then there's a question of, it's quite solid for certain European countries. Is it great for Ireland, considering we have a slightly different kind of background? We have certain opt-outs that they don't have. But there actually is quite a lot positive here. The way the government have handled passing it is insane. It's just been nonsense. I mean, was it Helen McEntee, Michael, who was asked why we couldn't just do the individual parts of this pact ourselves?
Yes.
And responded with, but sure, then why wouldn't we just sign up for it?
That was indeed the bold Helen. Not the only thing I want to know about it, but the thing that I particularly want to know about is European agreements like this tend to have a provision which is a bit like, when you contract to build a motorway, Gary, and you go over, you have penalties. They tend to have penalties for failure to execute or to comply. So, if you don't do X or Y, or you don't do it in a certain time, well, then you get fined. And nobody's been talking about this that I've heard of anyway. And my understanding is that there will be success and failure parameters. And my concern is not so much that the pact is a bad pact, but that we're signing into something where we have demonstrated a complete incapacity to execute our own regulations and laws. But we can do that without fining ourselves. I mean, we suffer, but we don't fine ourselves. And are we only going to end up having to pay out chunks of money to the EU because we've signed up to something that we have patently no capacity to implement, even if it was a good idea to implement it? And I'd like to know the answer to that question, because it may not be the case at all. But I think there are failure problems here.
Yeah, Fine Gael have taken a quite interesting approach on this, where they have managed to support it entirely, while also, when you hear their people talk about it, not actually seeming to understand some of what this does, or why it's being brought in, or really anything about it. It's kind of bizarre, actually.
Fine Gael have to do this because at the moment Fine Gael are actually doing, possibly, I don't know, possibly are actually doing proper European politics. You and I know from conversations we've had with friends in Europe that Fine Gael have not been considered best boys in class in the EPP. And especially in the more Christian Democrat wing of the EPP, which definitely would be the CDU and the CSU in Germany, which is the CSU. CSU is the Bavarian version of the CDU, which is the German Christian Democrats. And they're not popular, Gary. They're not considered very Christian, whatever about Democrat. So I think that since the motive force coming behind the Migration Pact is very much from the EPP, and I would say a lot of it's coming from the Christian Democrats, who are getting squeezed hard on their right in Germany on this issue, and in other countries. There are other Christian Democrat parties who are being pressed on this. They want to be full out there supportive of this project. So there may actually be an element of European politics, which is a good thing. They're doing good European politics. I don't know, Gary, did you notice, in a completely uncommented move, Fianna Fáil are doing very odd European politics.
Fianna Fáil have managed to create a situation where they are actively working to hurt Irish interests in relation to the appointment of a new Irish commissioner. And yeah, it's gone entirely uncommented on because, frankly, I don't think most people in Ireland pay terribly close attention to European politics, and even reporters generally don't know a lot about it. But here is what Fianna Fáil have done for the listeners. Fianna Fáil have put forward our Minister for Finance as the next Irish Commissioner and are currently agitating for him to be given a valuable, high-profile brief in the next European Commission.
Yes.
The next European Commission will almost certainly be led by Ursula von der Leyen.
Yes.
Now, von der Leyen is having a bit of difficulty, shall we say, getting the votes necessary to get across, because the EPP and the Socialists and the Renew, which is Fianna Fáil's group, kind of the Liberals, or at least they say they're the Liberals, have enough seats to get her elected, but it's not everyone is going to vote for her, and there's a concern that she might not reach the threshold, which is why they've been quietly talking to the ECR,
yes,
which is the European and Reformists. Sorry, the Conservatives and Reformists. Now, the problem there is that von der Leyen can't really deal openly with the ECR, as the Socialists have said that any, shall we say, extension of friendship to the ECR could see them leave the Grand Coalition. Now, that is unlikely, I think. Socialists don't generally want to leave power. Most politicians don't. But it is a situation where if the ECR doesn't come behind von der Leyen or independents, as they call them, unaligned, then von der Leyen may have a very difficult time getting elected. Von der Leyen is the person who will select what roles commissioners get in the new commission. Every Fianna Fáil MEP, every single one, has said they will vote against von der Leyen coming back as president of the commission.
And but Gary, they ran their campaigns and on the basis that they would not vote for von der Leyen. Now, I'm making that point because it's not just that they're saying it now. They actually ran, and they're now saying that they have a mandate based on the fact that they ran saying they wouldn't vote for von der Leyen. Now, I wanted to make just a few observations about that. Number one, I would be amazed if more than a handful of the people who voted for any of them were aware of the fact that they weren't going to support von der Leyen when it came to the presidency of the commission. And if a handful actually decided that that would influence the way they were going to vote, I would be amazed I'd be very curious, and I'd be very surprised if the number was large, if you were to poll the number of people in Ireland who know what grouping Fianna Fáil belongs to, or Fine Gael, but certainly Fianna Fáil, and if they knew anything about that grouping, and if they knew anything on top of that about the internal machinations of the appointment of the commissioners. Like, do they know that the Parliament has any role in the electing of the commission? Do they know that the President has any role in the appointment of commissioners? All of this is completely Brussels baseball, about which I think the Irish voter is almost totally ignorant. So the idea that this would be a central plank in your platform, is a bizarre notion. But then that you get to a position where Gary, they knew it was their turn because this job operates on Buggan's turn. Mairead McGuinness, the Fine Gaeler, was the last person to be on the commission who got a shitty job after they made a mess of the Phil Hogan, who had a big job, and when Phil had to go, he was replaced by Mairead. Mairead is going, so now it is Fianna Fáil's turn. And they've put forward Micheál McGrath, heavy hitter from the Taoiseach's own constituency and a potential rival to the Taoiseach, but that's completely coincidental, is being sent to Europe. And they have decided, even though, Gary, what were the odds of it not being von der Leyen, really? Because even if the projections for the European elections had gone a little bit more like some of the more destabilizing polls had shown them, it was going to be the Socialists being replaced by the ECR. So the chances that it wasn't going to be von der Leyen were fairly small. And now they're going to be in a position where we're going to be relying on von der Leyen to give their party man a big job. having said publicly, we will not give it. We will not vote for van der Leyen. Explain this to me, oh wise one.
It's hard to... it's one of those things you look at and go, to be honest, that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. I'm sure there was some grand thought behind it, but as you said, most of the public have no idea who van der Leyen is. Those who have an idea who she is have no idea how she's appointed. And of those who have some idea, how many of them actually oppose her reappointment? So it just seems like creating a massive stick to beat yourself with. At the same time, you're going to have to go to her and go, please ignore the fact we're trying to shank you. Give us something nice.
Because if they're not voting for van der Leyen, who are they voting for? I mean, the Liberals are not going to get their man in the job. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess. Actually, speaking of a mess, Kieran Mullooly.
We hear, now true or false, we don't know. These are words that we hear on the wind, but that Kieran is going party shopping.
Kieran is going party shopping indeed. So, Kieran Mullooly, a newly appointed MEP for Independent Ireland, had decided that he was going to join Renew, Fianna Fáil's group in the European Parliament. And that was all fine and dandy. He did all the meetings, it got into the papers, Mullooly to join Renew. And then he hit a little bit of a snag, Michael. Although it's unclear how much of a snag this is going to be overall. But this was the snag. Fianna Fáil is going to vote against him joining Renew. They're going to let him apply, and then when he applies, they're going to try and make sure he fails. Which would be, Michael, deeply humiliating to Kieran Mullooly. Although admittedly very funny.
Very, very embarrassing, because they allow you to make out the application, and in the application you say, this is the only club I want to join, because I think this is a really great club, and I'll be a super duper member to your club. And then you blackball him, and then he has to go look for another club, or stay out without a club. Because if he goes to another club, they're going to say, but you said that you wanted to be, why should we, what's going on here, Kieran, what's the story?
So, I mean, putting aside the question of the wisdom of trying to join Fianna Fáil's European Parliament grouping after having run as an independent and an opposition to the government, and the question of whether or not that looks good, because, frankly, well, I think it doesn't. I think most people don't pay attention to the level required to even know. But Fianna Fáil have not been terribly quiet about this either.
No!
They have been quite happily telling people that they're going to let him do this and then try and stop him. Now, open question of whether or not they could garner enough support and they can push it hard enough to actually keep him out. But one would suspect they probably can. But here's the fun part. And I was told this by someone who works in Brussels, who said it while laughing and saying he is entirely without shame. So, and this was a European political insider, Michael, the kind of person who it takes a lot to, to say that you were without shame, because some of the continentals, Michael, play politics pretty hard.
Oh, they play it well, Gary. They play it very well. And Brussels is a shameless town. It is a vie sans honte. But, yeah.
But this is what he told me. And it was this, that Mullooly appears to have learned about this because, again, Fianna Fáil aren't trying to keep it quiet. Well, actually, I would say the best option here for Mullooly is that he's heard about it and he isn't just doing this randomly. And that Mullooly's response was to start talking to the Greens.
This is what we hear, Gary. I mean, how we should put caveat emptors on that. We hear it from some very good people, but, they may be misinformed themselves. This is what's on, as we say, on the air and in the wind. It would be a remarkable choice, wouldn't it? To save the representation of the Greens in Ireland by ending up being Kieran Mullooly being the Irish Green delegation. There would be something.
If Independent Ireland's man, but more importantly, Michael Fitzmaurice's man,
yes, the turf cutters,
ended up joining the European Greens, it would be hilarious. Also incredibly embarrassing for everyone who helped him get elected, considering I would imagine a lot of those voters and a lot of those people are not, shall we say, Michael, deeply in sync with the European Greens.
Yeah, as I say, I mean, we're talking about the turf cutter people here, and the sheep farmers and the hill farmers and the whatever. There would be a deep comedy, a deep black irony to the idea that Kieran Cuff and Grace O'Sullivan could lose their seats in Dublin and the South, but the day was saved. The day was saved because Kieran McLooley came up and his white horse and saved the Greens in Ireland. How long he would stay in the European Parliament if he were to seek re-election, I would be sceptical on that basis. And indeed, the warmth of the welcome that he would receive as he returned to his constituency to hold whatever the version of Euro clinics are, that would be curious to see. But you know what? Maybe people wouldn't mind. Maybe he would be able to explain it. Maybe he would see his job as the missionary from the Atlantic West to explain to European Greendom how we have to work with these people and save a community. That diversity is our strength, Gary, as you're always telling me.
I always question when you hear things like this, because the information seems solid, but I always question how much independent candidates like Mullooly to the European Parliament actually understand about the European Parliament, how it works, what the parties are like, all of those sorts of things. Because the European Greens are fairly out there on a lot of stuff, and they're getting more out there over time. So you put Mullooly in that, and I think the immediate problem you run into there is that Irish people don't generally pay attention to European politics. But Mullooly and Independent Ireland and Fitzmaurice's particular voters may have an interest in knowing that their man is now in the same party as the German Greens.
The thing is, as he may discover, if he doesn't already know, the weirdest thing about European Greens is not their green policy. It's all the other stuff.
Oh, yeah.
These people are the progressives progressive. So if you want to, there's stuff on education, there's stuff on equity, diversity, inclusion, systemic racism, gender policies, everything in that kind of space. I don't know. I don't think it will go down well in Cavan or in Kilchamack. And maybe he hasn't had a good hard study of the wider policy basis. But it's not just about windmills and solar power.
Yeah, I mean, that carries a bit of weight. Maybe they don't know who they're talking to. But these people do put out manifestos. Detailed manifestos.
Yeah. And in English.
In English, on their love for social justice. And what that might actually look like. And what some of their environmental policies look like from a farming perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that was one of those pieces of news where I was told it and then just laughed. How I laughed for so long.
It's going to be curious. It's going to be curious to see how that goes. There's going to be lots of horse trading and negotiating going on in Europe for the next little while. See what's the story. But that particular one is one we'll pay attention. And you know what? You say, well, the voters won't know or care. My guess is that if this were to eventuate, that there would be people in Ireland who would make it their life's mission for the next 5 years to make sure that the voters of Ireland, North and West and Midlands knew very, very well exactly what was happening.
Well, I mean, Michael, we would have to congratulate Kieran Mullooly on finding a way to make voters care about European politics.
Absolutely.
Mostly because they want to, pull him from his home and burn him.
Yeah. Immolation being the ultimate ambition.
Anyway, from Europe to America, Michael, there were a couple of things to go through. We'll talk about the debate, which was fascinating in much the same way watching a corpse putrefy is fascinating. But
Thanks for
before we
that.
get to that,
That's beautiful. God. This the man who gave us the Rat King. Yes, lovely. Before we get to let's talk Chevron.
yes, so the Chevron principle is gone. Now, some of you might think, fantastic. Others of you might think, what the hell is a Chevron and where can I purchase that? Chevron was a legal principle in America which basically ruled that America has this massive administrative state of agencies. You know, the EPA, there's absolute tons of them. And they are, in many ways, quite influential. They have wide-ranging powers to regulate and oversee. Chevron was a legal precedent which said that in an instance where a court case arises in which a administrative body is taking a particular read of the law that gives them the powers that they have, courts must defer to the agency's understanding of that regulation. So what that means, because I imagine that's not terribly clear, is let's say you have a piece of law passed which says that the agency must act to ensure reasonable care is taken of the environment, and that goes to the EPA. The EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, can then pass hosts upon hosts of pieces of legislation, or sorry, not of legislation, but of internal regulation, which you can then force people to adopt, saying that it is given this power under that very vague statute. And under Chevron, courts basically had to say, unless it was incredibly egregious, yes, that is within your power. So basically Chevron allowed the administrative state to function in a particular way, which conservatives and libertarians found incredibly distasteful. And it's been in place for the last 40 years. It's gone now. The Supreme Court came down last week and said, no, Chevron is no longer in place. Now, they did say that the court can decide to defer to agencies on this on a case-by-case basis, but there is no longer an absolute or requirement to do so in bulk. There's a case called Looper Bright Enterprises v. Raimondo. And now what you had before was Chevron deference, which is deference to that case, which basically saw a lot of these gone through. This is one of those. I'm not going to say it's a small thing or that people are ignoring it. It's a topic of considerable conversation in America. But dismantling Chevron has always been a key part of basically forcing back the American administrative state into something which is more directly tied to legislation and which has far, far less ability to defend itself should it try and enact wide-ranging regulations that were perhaps not foreseen specifically by the American state. So I think quite a good thing. I think Chevron was unnecessary largely, and it did let some very strange instances arise where you were seeing people who had breached regulations but were not being told what they had breached, other than that they had breached regulations or what the nature was or how they'd breached it. And you had basically seen, I think the three-letter agencies, as they're jokingly referred to, kind of lose the run of themselves because they knew they could do nearly anything. And courts would just say, okay, yeah, well, that piece of legislation says they have to act to promote the common good, and therefore, yeah, this insane regulation is obviously part of that. So it will be, it'll be good to see it gone. I suspect now, instead of deference, you're probably going to see like a Looper Bright delegation or Looper Bright justification from this. But it's gone from, how I saw it explained by an American legal professional was, we've gone from wholesale to retail. Like individual cases can still be won on this basis, but it's going to be much harder for the collective to function on the assumption they can't really be challenged by the courts.
On the face of it, just for the kind of disposition that I would have temperamentally, it just seems like a very obvious kind of a decision, that ultimately the right to legislate should repose with the legislature rather than with unelected bodies, because otherwise, one of the fundamental questions you have to ask about any law, and a prerequisite for the possibility of a law being just, irrespective of its correctness or fairness, is how do you change the law? And in democracy, there has to be some connectivity between changing the law and the people who constitute the government, that is, the voters. Now, voters don't get to govern, but they get to constitute the government through voting, or whatever system each country has. And if you have legislation which has been created by appointed bodies, like, say, the EPA or the Federal Housing Agency or whatever it is, there is no obvious mechanism where you can change the law. The people cannot impact on the law. So therefore, those laws are anti-democratic and they are a priori unjust. It doesn't matter if they're good and fair and wise and lovely. They are bad laws because they cannot be changed. You have to have a mechanism where the people can influence those people who make the laws to change the laws. It's on a completely different side of this. I don't know, Gary, if you noticed a lot of the commentary about it was the fact, which it always is in the American courts these days, it's about how polarizing the issue was, or how much it manifested the polarized political nature of the court. Because I think you had Sotomayor, Jackson, and the three liberal, Kagan, were dissenting. And it's, oh God, look at the American. But there was a really interesting article in one of the American papers saying that actually, if you do an analysis, I think 15 out of 18 of the last cases had been unanimous. And even in the cases where they're dissenting, that you actually get people crossing over in dissents. Like, there was an interesting one, I don't know if you saw it, about the right of states to make it illegal for people who had committed domestic abuse to own firearms. I don't know if you saw that case.
No, I didn't actually.
Anyway, that was up. This statute had been deemed unconstitutional by the Fifth Circuit, and it went to the Supreme Court. And people were losing their lives. Supreme Court shouldn't be hearing this, ignoring the fact that actually, if they hadn't heard it, it would have maintained the status quo, which would have been that it was legal for abusers to have firearms, which was not what they wanted. And it was an 8-1 decision. I think Clarence Thomas, who takes a fairly absolutist, originalist understanding of that particular amendment. So it's just this, it's one of those things that the commentary on politics over here, particularly on American politics, is so basic. And so, I mean, we're tired, well, I'm tired anyway, talking about football team politics. And we're all guilty of it to an extent, but we should try at least to be aware that we're cheering for a team, rather than pretending that we are these wise, impartial judges, and that it's just obvious. And it's just a coincidence, Gary, that in every single case, Democrats good, Republicans bad. That's just the way it is. And it's nothing to do with our own particular biases or the colour of the lenses of the glasses that we wear. So you could, for example, look at the reportage about the fitness of the current president of the United States, and how the reportage has changed, Gary, somewhat in the last couple of days.
I mean, it has, but actually just to go back on your point before we touch on that, where you were saying that of the undemocratic nature of this, in defence of it, it's relatively common for countries to pass pieces of legislation which delegate certain powers to regulatory authorities.
It is, and to ministers. You could large sections of legislation, and I would say this has been increasingly over the last number of years. You will find a part of the legislation is at the discretion of the minister.
Yeah, hence why we have several things that were technically passed into law and just have never been activated.
Yes.
Not that I would complain about that, but I think the problem that we started to see with Chevron was you would have a situation where agencies were arguing something, the executive branch, the president, would get involved arguing that their reading of it was correct, whilst it was clearly not what was intended by Congress when they passed the legislation. And you could have a situation where the courts thought that the executive was wrong, but were constrained to agree with the executive and the agency, even though legally they didn't think it stood up because of Chevron deference. And I think you could argue that there was an actual impinging on the role of the separate parts of government, that the legal institutions were being constrained in a way that was not appropriate. And so it is good on that basis it fell.
There's also the element that, as you said, I mean, the problem was when you had pieces of legislation, when it was absolutely obvious from the historical documents and indeed from the commentary, current actual commentary from the legislature, that this was not the intent of the legislation. But the courts were bound to accept the understanding of the legislation from the perspective of the agency. And we all had to go around pretending that the agency didn't have a political disposition, or didn't have a political attitude, that the agencies are somehow these high, neutral, pure spirits, and they just dispose of justice without fear or favour, which of course is nonsense. They were coming from their own particular positions. But the courts were forced to take those positions on because that was as Chevron had construed it. But there you go.
And I will say, while the general talk about this is that this is a victory for the Conservatives and the Libertarians, should Trump take back power in the next election and bring his own people into these agencies, change their trajectory on a number of issues, Chevron would have been incredibly helpful to them as well, because they could have just internally changed the agency's read of what what regulations they should have in place, and then said, oh, well, the courts must show deference to our understanding because we have the right to determine this.
That's exactly right, but that's also exactly why Chevron was a bad decision. You cannot have a situation where the law changes. The law as written remains exactly the same, but it weirdly changes and mutates every time the administration changes. Again, going back to the theory of and practice of law, one of the things for a law to be a good law is that it must be predictable, and predictable in its application and in its outcome. And if you have it changing every time because the personnel within the agency changes, well, then that's not a good law. Or at least it's not a good way of looking at law.
I suppose the important thing, Aaron, we're kind of getting into the weeds of the arguments on this at this point, is that defenders of Chevron argue that the law was not changing, that there is a distinction to be made between regulations and how they are applied by an agency and the actual underlying law, which remains constant, and which there is the possibility of overturning if the agency is deemed to not be acting in a way that's congruent with it. You know, Congress can pass, they can amend the underlying law, they can put restrictions in place. And so that was the argument of defenders of Chevron, that basically this was necessary because legislation is sometimes unclear, but there was always democratic oversight of it. Now, that kind of ignores the fact that American, the legislature has become increasingly kind of dysfunctional, as Chevron has been there for longer and longer. So it's one of those wonderful things of, well, just pass a law if you don't think this is going well. It can be quite difficult.
So before we leave this completely, on a tangential subject, a lot of people, and clever people, and some of them that are so clever that they often agree with me, have said that one of the benefits of this will be that it will actually help innovation. Now, without going into the details about that, just on passing, there was a document published this week which was an analysis of the number of patents awarded across the world over the last few years, and breaking down into sort of EU, UK, United States, Japan, China, etc. If you were looking at this in any sense as a forward indicator of the health of a region or an economy, Gary, it would be terrifying. We seem to be embracing in Europe an attitude regarding regulation, which is we are going to regulate ourselves to death. We've seen it with AI. We are seeing it with a hell of a lot of other tech. We're seeing it in biotech. We're seeing it in the petrochemical industry. The petrochemical industry, which was not that long ago one of the largest industries in Europe, it's the same size as the automotive industry, worth $1 trillion to the EU economy, is basically leaving. It's leaving Europe and going to the States. And the Chinese are way ahead on the patents now. Obviously, a patent, not every patent is the same as another patent. You could have 10,000 patents which have the same economic value as one really good patent. So it's not all about numbers. But when it comes to this, if anybody's out there, just if you're curious, we talk about the United States here, and I think we have lost a sense of how much Europe has stagnated in the last 20 or 30 years. And against all of the predictions, the American economy, has just kicked on, and the gaps that have opened up. And one of the central ones is the Americans consistently innovate. Look at the number of companies in Europe, of the 100 largest companies in Europe. Look at the number that were opened in the last 40 years, founded in the last 40 years. I think you'll find it's virtually none. And you compare that to the United States. And anyway, the United States seems to be in a process for a while now of trying to find ways of liberating itself from things that have stymied innovation and encouraging it. And in Europe, we seem to be increasingly embracing the idea that we can regulate ourselves into wealth, and it's not going to work.
Yeah, I saw there's a photo from the European Parliament celebrating how Europe had become the first place to put in regulation of AI. And it did strike me as the wonderfully European thing of, well, we don't have it, so let's regulate it into existence. Which never quite seems to work out and is oftentimes driven by the French, who on economic affairs have an economy that no one seems to quite understand and frankly should not work, but somehow does. So, great for them, but perhaps not the people to be pushing for appropriate regulatory stance. I mean, look, anyone in business knows America is a much easier country to run a business in. It's much easier to hire. It's much easier to fire, depending on the state.
Depends on the state. I mean, we shouldn't overestimate that. I mean, Ireland is a fairly easy country to do business in. At a regulatory level. I mean, the problem for if doing business in Ireland, it comes in more as a revenue and fiscal problem.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of problems in Ireland anyway. But,
yeah, one or two,
which I will not get into now for my own sanity. But in America, things are just generally easier. Everything from bankruptcy law to tax treatment, again, depending where you are, is generally preferential. I mean, there's American states that have no income tax. And you might think, well, what's the benefit of that to business owners? It's, well, actually, the benefit is that your wages that you pay to employees are worth more. So you can pay them less and they can actually be better off. So it reduces costs on the business. And there's a whole host of things that are beneficial for that. They also have a massive culture of innovation and of failure and of doing it again that Europe largely does not have.
Yep.
Certain parts of Europe has it, but again, you're dealing with stuff that's being regulated by the French and the Germans. And oftentimes when they announce regulations they say are going to make Europe more competitive, if anything, they would seem to place more onerous burdens on business makers. We love grants, Michael.
Oh, no.
We love really, really specialised grants that require immense detail to apply for and are very tightly guarded so that you probably have to bring in someone to do it for you.
We love...
because that's what businesses need, Michael. Yeah. They need like when you're in trouble, what you want is like a 6-month turnaround grant that requires you to pay a professional to apply for it because it's so complicated.
We love a grant.
Which is not everything the European Union does. I'm in part being facetious.
We also love investing in things, Gary. We love investing. The government's going to invest. And the problem is very often we talk about things and they say we're going to invest X in this thing. And you look at it and think, well, that sounds like a very good thing. Surely that must be a good thing. But again and again, they do these very good things. Everybody agrees this was a very good thing. And then you go back 10 years later and say, Actually, turns out, for example, I remember reading there was a big analysis done by The Economist and others about the money spent by South Korea on rolling out internet. That they had this thing when the internet started to happen. The South Koreans, we're going to get there first. We're going to have and they spent what at the time was a very large amount of money. I think it was 15 billion or something on rolling out. And when people went back to see what kind of economic impact all this had, it was none, basically. One of the things that we talk about here is we love the fact that we're going to have a really highly educated population. We're going to have a great so now we have the highest proportion of anybody, I think, in the OECD of our students that go on to third level education. The problem is we have now generated a situation where we have serious bottlenecks in other parts of the economy, say in the craft and the trades element of the economy. We can't get people, which has created serious economic impact. But also you've got, some people would say, a devaluing of the quality of the degrees the academic quality of the degrees being offered. But we don't have the kind of investment in the kind of R&D and colleague-located R&D, say in STEM, that other more successful countries have. Although, again, other analysis would say, actually, it turns out governments pouring loads of money into this. The problem is governments shouldn't be choosing winners. That's my basic thing. When governments decide this is going to be the thing that we're going to spend our money on because this is going to be the driver of economic growth, they almost never get it right. And they may even cause other problems by having crowding out effects or diverting talent from one area to another. You get misplaced capital and misplaced human capital, which is sometimes even worse. So leave it alone.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm still just annoyed about GDPR coming in.
Yeah, and
just a pointless regulation.
One of these days, somebody will do. Well, not somebody. Many bodies will get together and do a kind of a study on the economic costs of GDPR. And Gary, the feeling in deep in my bones is going to be whopping.
Yeah, for basically no benefit. On, I think actually there's certain companies where you look at and you sort of go, that couldn't happen in Europe. That would simply, it just wouldn't happen. And it can in America. And there's a number of those companies. I thought it was quite interesting looking at why they can arise in America but couldn't in Europe. There's one in particular I'm thinking of. It's a company called Anduril. It's led by a guy called Palmer Lucy, who was the guy who invented the Oculus, the VR headset, and ended up going into Facebook when it was Facebook, and was basically forced out for his political beliefs.
Okay.
He was kind of aligned. I'm not sure if he was pro-Trump as such or more anti-Hillary Clinton, but he was basically forced out of
bad
Facebook.
Man, anyway.
And he created a company called Anduril. And what Anduril is it's a defense company. A defense company unlike anything else working in the American space, and that's doing quite fascinating work in the field of autonomous weapons, surveillance, all that sort of jazz. But it's just an interesting little one that basically someone went, there is a problem with defense procurement in America, therefore I am going to invest massive amounts of money into this, and I'm just going to create an entirely new company with no prior links to the Department of Defense, and I'm going to perform so well, and we're going to do this on such a good model, that I am going to be able to get my way into the defense budgets of America. And he has done so. He's done so actually in a quite interesting way. Most of the defense companies work on what they call a cost plus basis, where basically they will, the American government will tell them they need a particular thing, and they will agree to take it on. And the deal is that the American government will pay all of the costs associated with the project plus a margin. Now, if you tell that to a normal person, most people will figure out pretty quickly that produces a whole host of really bad incentives. And it also means that you're kind of relying on the Department of Defense to drive innovation, which is not good because it's the Department of Defense. Anduril works on a different system. They just build things and then try and sell them to the Department of Defense.
Well, okay. Anyway, Gary, before let's get too deep into too many rabbit holes, we need to talk about the debate.
We do. I watched Trump v. Biden. There'd been a topic of conversation inside Gript on it. John McGurk particularly was pushing the idea, and it's not an unreasonable idea, that the Republicans had oversold Biden's issues, and all Biden needed to do was come out and look basically competent, and people would say, oh, he's better than he was made out to be. I never really bought that because, there's how people involved in politics and interested in politics think things are and how they see things, and there's how the general public see things. The general public in a country like America was probably relatively unaware of all the Republicans are saying about Joe Biden's cognitive decline. It would have probably picked up kind of the general mood music of it, but not enough, I think, to have counterweighed even a decent performance. What we got was not a decent performance. What we got was it looked like he had died and been resurrected through experimental magic and put on the stage.
Experimental magic. None of that.
And it was just crushing. He did not seem to know where he was. What he was saying was embarrassing. There were periods of lucidity in it, but overall it indicated that what I had been hearing from people I know in the Republican space about him was accurate. I obviously they've been saying it publicly, but I've been talking to people privately who are relatively high up in the Republican administration in kind of background roles. I'd been asking them, is he actually that bad, or are you just saying this because there's some political benefit to you? And the general line I got back was, no, he is actually worse than you think, and worse in a lot of ways than we're saying. But you never quite know, Michael, because there's always perhaps an underlying tribalism. That was not the case. He absolutely came apart. I've never seen anything like it, and it was legitimately embarrassing. And I saw some of the descriptions from Irish reporters as they were watching it, and it was stuff like Trump is lying repeatedly and Biden lacks the vim to chase him on his lies. And I was like, Biden lacks the vim to fucking stay upright. Like, he was visibly swaying at parts of it. What he was saying was damaging, but I think the actual worst part was it was broadcast using a split screen, so you could constantly see Biden's face. And there were parts of the debate, large parts of it, where Biden was just staring into the fucking void, swaying.
Yeah.
He did not. I thought the most cutting part of it, and I think the part of it that is just going to be shown endlessly if Biden remains the nominee, is he was talking about immigration. And he just gave this incoherent ramble. And when it went to Trump said, I don't know what he said at the end there, and frankly, I don't think he knows.
Yes.
And then just moved on.
I thought
it looked like at times Donald Trump was trying to be nice to him.
Several people had said to me that they're making this terrible mistake. The Republicans are playing it up. The Democrats are bringing down expectations. All he has to do is turn up and not fall over his shoelaces, and he will get, at the very worst, a draw. He'll probably get a win. I never bought that, simply because either he has some kind of decline, or he doesn't. And if he doesn't, he'll win, because he'll just turn up and he'll be better. Because Trump, remember that in the last election, Trump had 3 very bad debates. He was very poor. He in the previous election, he had one good one decent one okay one. But that's what. But if he does have any issue, you put this guy in front of cameras, under lights, in the evening for 2 hours, in a stressful situation. If this is an issue, it is impossible that over that period of time he will not fall. He will not make 1 or 2 really obvious errors that will be just lethal because they'll be played over and over and over again. As it turns out, Gary, it's not a question of a small... It was catastrophic. Okay, let's contextualize the fact that it was a CNN poll. now a CNN poll of CNN viewers is going to, shall we say, strongly skew Democrat and Liberal Democrat. And they said 67-33 that Trump won the debate. Now, that's a remarkable result on a CNN poll. Genuinely, I would like to meet the 33% who thought that Joe Biden won the debate, because, well done, lads. That's truly committing to the bit. But that bit where you mentioned that where Trump said, I don't know what he said there at the end, and I don't know if he did either. And then he moved on. And that was the brilliant thing about it. He said it. He didn't say it, as Donald could have done, in a jeery, sneery, laughing kind. He just said it flat, as a matter of fact, and then he moved on. Trump did it really well. I thought Trump didn't give in to the impulses that he may or may not have. I don't know Donald Trump. Maybe he's a monster. Maybe he's a human being. Whatever. Maybe he's a mixture of the two. It may be that as a human being of a certain age himself looked at that and thought, Jesus, you shouldn't do this. But Gary, here's the thing. Everybody's now talking about replacing him, right? Suddenly, we saw shameless guys who 3 months ago were saying, there was one journalist saying, he's not just cogent, he is beyond cogent. He's the
best he's ever been.
The best he's ever been. He's more analytic and detailed than he's ever been. He's fantastic, blah, blah. Now, 3 months later, he has to go. One of the Republican commentators, shall we say, from that kind of crystal rhino bit of the party said, sort of, shall we say, the fancy intellectually types were saying, the Democrats have a real problem here, and he said Obama knows it, because he was parsing a statement made by Obama. If the Democrats come out and say he is no longer fit to run, so we have to replace him, then what are they saying about the man who is actually and currently and will be until next January president? Is he fit to be president? You can't, his argument, and I think there's a power to it, you can't hold two things. You can't say he's not fit to run, but he is fit to be president. If he's not fit to be president, then he's not fit to run. Fine, but you can't have it the other way around. They have created a monstrous problem for themselves.
The Republicans are incredibly happy with how the debate went. If I was them, I would be less happy based on two things. One is as you put forward, it's given a focus to the arguments that Biden should not be the candidate. And now, that's a very difficult thing to do if Biden doesn't agree, and it looks like he won't, but it's given some focus to it. And the problem is that Trump is actually eminently beatable. And I think you saw that in his actual debate performance. Trump did not do well. There were a couple of highlights of it, and he was extremely good at playing to the camera. There were a couple of times when Biden would say something, and Trump would look at him and then just look directly towards the camera in a sort of, are you listening to this? Like, this guy is not here. Like, he's not in the room. Which actually, I think, played extremely well. But he was all over the place. People say he was more focused than they've seen him before. He's clearly getting older himself. He struggled incredibly to keep on topic. He did his usual kind of rambling. And it just wasn't terribly persuasive. Also, Trump's habit of, just lying about things. Or just bragging them up to such a level where they're kind of ridiculous, as opposed to just saying, I was better than him at that.
Yeah.
By whatever margin. Although compared to Biden said multiple things that were wrong. Multiple things. Even CNN's fact check of the debate was savage. Deeply unkind to him. And to put in context how badly he did, I was listening to them and going, that's not right. That's not right at all. And then I thought, but he's probably not lying, because he lacks the mental capacity to know that that's wrong. I mean, Michael, my joke that this year the slogan should be, this year vote for the person found mentally competent to stand trial, has never been as solid.
I kept thinking of that because several people kept saying, tweeting, just remember, we vote for the good guy, not for the convicted felon. And I kept thinking, yeah, But why is the good guy not a convicted felon? Because his own Department of Justice decided he wouldn't be fit to stand trial. And I don't know if that's something that you want to keep reminding people of.
No, you're right. The problem with Biden also, Biden is clearly not fit to run for another presidential term. If he's this bad now, imagine what he'd be like 3 or 4 years down the road. But it also raised the question of, well, he's clearly not fit to be president now.
Exactly.
So who is running this show? And how did this debate go ahead? This was an extremely early debate. His team would have had to agree to it. They say he's been spending a week or over a week preparing for it. Given how bad he is, they had to have known how he was going to look there. Now, with people who are of that age and are becoming senile or experiencing cognitive decline, you can have periods of lucidity. And then you can also have periods of nonsensical babbling, as we found. But I very much wonder how much his team is in control and how much he and his wife are in control. Because it seems to me, Michael, that his wife is playing a large influence on this. And it may be that his team didn't want him to do the debate, but he's got enough lucidity that he was able to go, well, I am. I'm going to agree to it and you can't stop me. Conversely, I think there's a likelihood that we should consider, which is that his team doesn't want him as the nomination and agreed to a debate so that people could see how bad he is. Because the conversation immediately starting in the Democratic Party is panic, just wild panic. Now, Biden has come out, he's given a public rally where he's appeared quite cogent and they've come up with some good lines to use against the debate. But, I mean, yeah, he looks okay now has just led to, well, the jokes about, well, the drugs have finally kicked in. And I'm not sure that's terribly helpful for anyone. Did you see the video? There are 2 videos I saw that were not of the main debate, which I thought were incredibly illuminating. One was the video shot by someone who's in the crowd. Important to note here that Biden's team selected nearly all of the requirements of that debate.
Yes, they laid out
and also,
rules.
Media professionals were not allowed in that building, but kept in another building on the chance that there would be a medical emergency involving one of the speakers, by which I think we can safely say they meant Biden.
Yes.
But there was a video taken of Biden trying to walk off the stage afterwards to talk to the moderators. And it was not good. He struggled to get down a single step, Michael, without the help of his wife. And a second video came out, which is him going to meet with supporters. And his wife has the microphone, Jill Biden, and she turns to him and says, "You did so well, Joe. You answered every question." And the crowd cheers, and Biden just has this half smile with his mouth open, staring glassy-eyed into the cheering crowd. And you just kind of think to yourself, this man has no fucking idea where he is. Like, also, the high bar of the president in a debate is not you answered every question.
No, not really.
Anytime you were prompted, you had a response. Fabulous.
It's obviously a very different way that you look at somebody who is doing a presidential debate than if you met somebody who was out having a drink in your local, who was the same age and the same condition as Joe Biden. He might be absolutely fine in the context of being a man in his early 80s, just out about playing a game of cards or having a drink in the pub. It may not be that Biden is actually massively in a sort of, shall we say, an end stage in cognitive decline. He may just have bits and pieces of moments where he doesn't quite get where he is. It also, he can only handle a certain period of time, after which tiredness will have a large impact on him. He can't stay up there. No, I'm not. Obviously, all of these things should be disqualifying factors for being the president of the United States. What I mean is that it's perfectly possible that in the normal run of things, he has more than enough capacity to say, no, I'm going ahead. I'm going to do the debate. I am going to run for the presidency. Because it's not something which has invaded completely all of his hours and all of his days. And most of the time, he's okay. But most of the time he's okay is not something you want to say about the president. And as regards Trump, Absolutely, Trump is beatable. I said to you before, I think we said it on the podcast, it may well be that the Democrats have done a remarkable thing twice. When they nominated Hillary, they nominated the only person effectively that Trump could beat in 2016, and this time round in Biden Mark II, they've nominated the only person that Trump could beat again. I think in 2016 there were Republicans who could have beaten lots of Democrats, but when Trump won the nomination, I think that Hillary was the you know what, as ridiculous as it seems, I'm not sure that he would have beaten Bernie Sanders.
I wouldn't have been surprised if he didn't because of Sanders' popularity in certain areas. I think one way this might be bad for the Republicans is if Biden can actually be replaced. The problem there is that that's not impossible, but very difficult to do without Biden's agreement.
Gary, yes, they could replace him. I get that. But is not the whole of the Democratic Party and the machinery of the Democratic Party implicated now in Joe Biden? They have been maintaining the fiction that the man is fine, that it's all nonsense, that these are deep fakes, they're badly edited videos, it's all rubbish, Joe is fine. It's now out of the bag, Joe is not fine. And you've been lying to us. And everybody in the Democratic Party is in some sense is going to be implicated in that. And I don't think that this is something that they as a party can recover from.
Yeah, they're going to have severe problems. They really need him to drop out willingly if they want to replace him on the grounds of health or something like that.
An open-topped car in a southern city on a tour. It's happened before.
And then you complain about me making dark jokes.
I'm just saying that, politically speaking, for Joe, it would be better if Joe left because Joe was unwell.
So what are you suggesting? We just put him in a car, prop him up with a broom, and just 24 hours just drive him around downtown Dallas?
I'm saying it would be better for the Democratic Party if Joe were to leave of his own volition. But then you see, Gary, then you know what happens. What happens?
Kamala Harris happens?
Kamala Harris becomes president of the United States. And I'm not sure, and that means that Kamala Harris automatically becomes the heir apparent and the candidate for the next election. I don't think that's necessarily an upwing swing for the Democrats.
There was a particular argument I saw that just it was made by an Irish journalist, and it just really highlighted the danger of talking about things when you actually don't know the technicalities of it. Because they were saying that what they thought was likely was a Kamala Harris Gavin Newsom ticket. Which might think, Michael, on the face of it, seems like the way to go. Gavin Newsom is far better than Harris, frankly. He's got he's a good politician. He is probably the front runner for the next presidential election. Harris, it looked like he might go now. But
I may be completely off them. Is Harris not California?
Well, that's the thing that they didn't know. Harris is California as well. And for the listener, why that is important is because of the 12th Amendment, which says that in order for the party to stand in the president's election in a state, at least one of the president or the vice president must not come from that state. So if you ran the ticket that they want, the Harris-Newsom ticket, you could not get any electoral votes in California.
So they'd lose the election.
So they'd lose the election because California has, I think, 54.
Yeah, it's the biggest electoral college votes in the States.
So what you're really saying is, let us run this ticket, which is constitutionally disallowed from winning.
I also, by the way, I think that Newsom may be a competent performer. But if I was a Republican, I would be very happy to run on Newsom's running of the Californian economy and the state of downtown San Francisco and Los Angeles. That would not be a problem for me.
I think a good Republican candidate could take apart Newsom. I think the problem that you would find is that
Donald.
In a debate situation, he's just better than Trump. Particularly in the debate situations that I think they're going to replicate. There was a general consensus that what they did with Biden worked really well. And even the Republicans were happy with it, with how CNN had moderated it. So, I mean, that tells you something about it. And in a debate like that, Newsom will just cut Trump apart. Like, Trump, as I said in this, he wasn't good. He just had the great benefit that his opponent was apocalyptically corpse-like. But, it is what it is.
Yeah.
And actually, Michael, just before we close, I just wanted to mention something very briefly.
Yeah.
One of the potential danger of hubris, Michael. Macron calling the French elections, the 2 rounds, one is today, one is, I think, in a week. Basically, Le Pen did extremely well at the European elections, and in order to push back against Le Pen and her people, he called a snap election. The problem they have, Michael, is that Le Pen is currently polling at 35%, which in France is very good.
It's very, very good. And it turns out that Macron is being pushed on the right by Le Pen, which was expected, but he's also being pushed on the left. Unexpectedly powerful campaign being run to his left also. So he may be getting very badly squeezed. And it may turn out to be a horrible... I mean, there is talk. I don't offhand remember the precise ins and outs of the French parliamentary electoral system, how much of a bonus you get for coming first, etc. But there was talk, I mean, on the basis of the current polling, that Le Pen might actually get a majority in Parliament.
So there's 81 seats. Those the European results I'm thinking of, in which Le Pen got over 30%. Yes, there's now danger of a National Front majority government, which is, say, Michael, not perhaps what Macron wanted to do when he called the snap election. And to be fair, when he called the snap election, for the first couple of days, it actually looked like, oh, maybe this will work. Because you saw, not Le Pen, but Le Pen put out a call for unity amongst the parties of the right, and that basically destroyed some of the parties of the right as they fell into infighting about whether or not they should support that call. And it seemed to be working. And then it wasn't. It very much wasn't.
No, I mean, no, we should make, just en passant mention, it's not Marine Le Pen. It's the National Rally, not the National Front anymore.
Sorry, it's National Rally.
The National Front was the party established by her late... I was going to say her late father. Is her father dead? Or just hanging around?
I believe so.
They had something of a breakdown of the relationship because he didn't like the way that she had gone all soft and woolly and moderate and lefty on him, on some of her policies, but and not quite sufficiently Euro-skeptic, I think, was one of them. But anyway, it's the National Rally of the RN these days. Yeah, it looks like it may be turning out very badly for Emmanuel as we end. Do you remember when he came first, he said he was going to have a Jupiterian presidency? I remember thinking, I don't know what that means, but I know that only a president of France could say it. Jupiter. Can you imagine someone arriving in the Oris and saying, I'm going to have a Jupiterian presidency? Or Leo Varadkar or Micheál Martin saying, I'm going to have a Jupiterian Taoiseachship. I think at that stage, the people in the white coats will be coming and leading them away.
I mean, I can see how he's saying it, but that's about it.
Well, I can see how he's thinking it, certainly. One of the best things ever was when you see those interviews, meetings, how he had with Mitterrand, because it really was like the meeting of two spirits, grand imperial spirits. How he never felt that he was in the room with somebody who didn't deserve to be in.
Yeah, I suppose actually just on Macron, his political coalition, which is called, I think it technically translates as Together.
Oh God.
Symbol. It's a mishmash of people. They are polling at 20% against Le Pen at 35%.
It's not good.
Well, it's not good for Macron,
No.
which is interesting at the European level because Macron has had immense amounts of influence there, even though Renew was only the third largest party, partially just by being leader of France. But you have a very bad European election, and then you're shaping up to have quite a bad national election. It's not... It's perhaps not great.
It's interesting you say about people having disproportionate influence. There's a really interesting article in the Financial Times, which was echoed another article in one of the other sort of heavyweight European papers, basically saying that while they're not going to be officially in, we shouldn't overstate the way that things are run in the. It's not really formally a coalition government in the Parliament. It's coalition-like, but anyway, that the person who's going to have enormous levels of influence and has been working away in the background and doing lots of very good work negotiating is Giorgia Meloni. Meloni is going to be a very important figure in the next Parliament as the Prime Minister of Italy, but also as the effective leader of the European Conservative and Reform Party, which is, I think, the third group now.
It is the third group now, and although there's concerns, some of the Polish are talking about whether or not they will set up some sort of regional bloc with for Eastern European countries on geography rather than ideology. And if that happens, I think they have 14 in the ECR, so that might. There's a bit of fluidity to this for the next kind of couple of weeks.
Always in Europe, lots of fluidity. Lots of flux.
But currently, as I was saying earlier, the issue with Meloni is that the socialists have said that any extension of friendship to Meloni or the ECR is going to be enough grounds for them to walk away. Now, that's an extreme thing for them to do. But it's hard to tell when you're looking at Europe. There's a lot of language coming out that Meloni was cut off from these things or wasn't involved and is very unhappy with not being allowed to get her people a certain amount of top jobs, things like that. It's difficult to say if that's actually what's happening or if von der Leyen basically has to play this a certain way to keep the socialists on side.
Yeah.
And this is basically stage management between her and Meloni.
But very much
hard to say exactly what's happening.
But isn't it also the case, Gary, that was the narrative at the beginning? Then there was the great story about the dinner where the EPP and the socialists got together, basically to hash everything out and divvy everything up. Then that news broke and everybody else got pissed off and said they weren't a bit happy with this and now it was going to be an issue. And the deal fell apart. And the socialists, I think, have become aware that they're in actually a weaker position than they like to think that they are. And now, again, depends which channel you're going down and who you're listening to. But it seems that after the dinner debacle, there seems to be a sense that Meloni has been having conversations and she is in a position to think that she's going to get some of the good jobs. But we'll know shortly. But whatever happens, it's bizarre to look at that picture of the G7, wasn't it? And the only one that really looked like she was comfortable that she's going to have a job next year was Meloni.
I mean, Meloni, to give an understanding of how well it is going for Meloni at the minute, Meloni is an Italian leader who has become more popular in office.
Yeah.
Which doesn't really happen, Michael.
I think the Emperor Claudius probably became more popular in office than he had been before, but I'm not sure.
So not unprecedented, but it's been a while.
It's been a while, yeah. And on that classical note, I think we'll say goodbye to the good people. And mind yourselves. And are you away next week?
No, I am here until the end of July, where I will go and bring students over to Washington in the EBI's annual pilgrimage.
Yes. So until then, have a good week and we'll talk to you again on Sunday.
All the best.